Koehl, Lewisboro town historian, and today we are going to do part 2 of Lewisboro Ladies. A few weeks ago we did part 1, and just a brief recap of who we talked about. The first lady was Belinda Koehl, who was a Methodist minister's wife from Golden's Bridge from the early 19th century. Then we visited with Edith Bailey, who, with her husband Pierce Bailey, built the house that we know now as Four Winds, and she was a suffragette. So she takes us to the early 20th century, the first decades of the 20th century. From there, we talked about Alice Poor, who was a benefactress to the town, gave the town honor to where we're filming today. From Alice Poor, then, excuse me, we ended with Mary Louise Boughton, also from the era of mid-20th century. And Louise Boughton was well known in town as an early childhood educator. Today, we're going to talk about 4 more ladies. The first lady will be Alice Mead Neargard, who was, I think, in one word, we could call her an organizer and a go-getter, and get things done getter, I should say, really. Then we're going to talk about Huldah Keeler Poe, who was the town gravedigger. And then we're going to talk about a writer and illustrator and author named Mary Frances Bacon, better known as Peggy Bacon. And lastly, we're going to talk about Colleen Dewhurst. Colleen Dewhurst probably was the most famous of the ladies I'm going to talk about today. And Colleen was well known as an actor. So we're going to go back to the beginning of the ladies I just talked about. We're going to talk about Alice Mead Neargard today. Alice was born in 1877. She died in 1961, and she was the last of the 4th generation of Meads, the Meads who founded Mead Street. She was the 11th of 12 children of George Washington Mead and Sarah Studwell Mead. There were 6 boys and 5 girls, or it might have been the opposite. Anyway, Alice Neargard was an organizer. She was an extraordinary person, very, very instrumental in organizing the American Red Cross ladies during World War I in the Northeast, especially around New York City area. And she continued that work in World War II. Alice Mead was born in Brooklyn, but summered in Wacabuck her entire life. She made her debut in 1897. She was small, somewhat plump, feminine. She had flashing hazel eyes. She was effusive. She was not domineering, but she was used to getting things done her way, especially from Charles, her husband. She married Charles in 1902. Charles Neargard, of Danish extract, was a fairly well-known hospital designer and planner and did a lot of traveling. So the couple never had any children, but when she died, she did leave 64 nieces and nephews, and was very, very much adored by them, and she adored them. In 1931, they started to build their stone house on Mead Street in Wacabuck. Now, this disturbed some of her Mead Street neighbors because there'd never been anything but a colonial or a Victorian house on Mead Street. So to build a stone house was quite an addition to the neighborhood. She probably was not a cook, but she employed a wonderful cook and housekeeper, and many, many wonderful meals were enjoyed at their house. Most of what I'm going to tell you about Alice is from an interview that I did with her niece, Susan Henri, also who lives on Mead Street, and one of those 64 nieces and nephews. Another thing that the Neargards did not, as I said, have any children, but they did raise red setters who were the pride and joy of their life. Alice loved to play the organ in the afternoon happenings at Mead Chapel. She often played for Vespers, and in Susan's words, probably not the best, but a very willing organist. She was idealistic. Most of her projects were always of value, either to the town or even the wider community. As I said earlier, she was very instrumental in a lot of the work that the Red Cross did, not only during World War I, but again during World War II. During World War I, she was known as a Gray Lady, and she worked in military hospitals in New York City, bringing care packages. They called them. They would bring care baskets, which had writing implements, writing paper, chocolates, maybe a bouquet of flowers. The Gray Ladies would bring these baskets around to the boys in the hospital, who were either there for extended stay or were going to be reemployed in the field of battle. 1918, well, we know 1918 as the cessation of the war, but in New York City, and in fact throughout a lot of the country, it was a huge flu epidemic. So Alice was there with her Gray Ladies, her Red Cross ladies, to supply the needs and the wants of the flu patients in the hospitals. Now, to get to some of the things that she did around Lewisboro, according to Susan Henri, her aunt, who she called Auntie Al, was great at marshaling the forces of our generation and urging us on. In Lewisboro, she was very, very active in the American Red Cross, both recruiting and training other members of the community, doing making bandages, making sure people were knitting for the armed services. Let's segue a little bit to World War II, where she also was involved with the Red Cross. And here in town, she was personnel director of the Lewisboro Defense Council, which means that she was in charge of basically the home battlefront, making sure that scrap was collected. And during World War II, all the school children were involved in collecting tin and papers, and she was in charge of all that collecting. The community, and especially the children, collected tons and tons of these scrap materials. The early ecology movement and recycling movement, for sure. She organized classes in first aid and in home nursing. She was instrumental in getting a nutrition canteen started, and anything that you needed to learn about home defense, Alice was there to teach you. She was always looking for things that could help her hometown. Basically, their home was in New York City, and their Mead Street home was for summers and weekends. But after a while, they did come up here permanently. She organized and was director of the District Nurses Association thrift shop. The thrift shop was in the building that people like to ask about on Main Street. It looks like an old store, and indeed it was the old George Lawrence General Store. But during World War II, and up until that time and a little bit after, it was the District Nurses Association thrift shop. Now it belongs to the Textile Conservation Workshop. So it's still producing pursuing a worthwhile cause. She started an arts and crafts course, which met on the 3rd floor of that building, because the ladies of the town decided they need something better to do than just sit home and do housework and make the beds. So they had an arts and crafts meeting that met several times a week. And that segued into people really getting interested in it. The ladies would do hooked rugs, they'd do art and metal art crafts, and then they would sell their bracelets and their necklaces and their hooked rugs at the D&A thrift shop. After a while, it just got, the thrift shop was too small, and it moved to a barn over on Spring Street called the Bacon Barn. and a little bit more about the Bacon Barn later. But she, as I said, she was interested in so many things. Not only did the Bacon Barn house the thrift shop, the Bacon Barn also became the home of the South Salem Drama Club, in which Alice Neergaard was an organizer. I don't believe she ever acted in the drama club, but she certainly was one of the people instrumental in getting it started and in helping fund it. And she just, if there was a cause and a need, Alice was there. She died on July 10th, 1961, at the age of 83, the last of the fourth Meade generation. And as I said before, she left 64 nieces and nephews, of which Susan Henri and her brother Tim were 2. And I think we'll leave Alice at that point. Our next lady is Huldah Keeler Poe, born in 1894. Huldah was from, as I said, the Keeler family. She was born in the house that is now the state police station across from the Episcopalian Church on Spring Street. She was from a musical family, and music was in her heart as well. Huldah sang bass in the South Salem Presbyterian Church choir. As I said, she was every woman, but she also was a very strong person, and she was the town gravedigger. She went to school in the schoolhouse behind the Salem Market, and she grew up, as I said, in a farm family, so she was used to doing all sorts of chores. She, in 1916, she married John Poe. Now, from what I hear, John Poe was more of a poet than anything else. And so while Huldah was busy building her garage, which later turned into a house, John Poe supposedly sat next to where Huldah was working in the fields, writing poetry. And I'm going to read you one of his poems in a little bit. When Thaddeus Keeler died, the Keeler children inherited the farm, so to speak. And Huldah, her brother Jerry, and her brother Elisha inherited the land, which is now around Keeler Court. Elisha inherited the house, which now belongs to Gary Page and his wife, and it was called Happy Home. So Huldah started out to build her garage behind the Happy Home house on Main Street. Jerry had the property next to that to build his home. Well, Huldah started building, and the people who live in that house now, George and Wynne Van Marter, say that house was built to stand a lifetime. George said whenever he tried to do any kind of fixing, he'd come across the nails that Huldah used to build the house, which were more like spikes. That there wasn't any moving of anything that she built. Well, turned out that she was very, very careful about what was her property, what was Jerry's property, and what was Elisha's property. And she put up her markers, her metal markers delineating her property, and nobody was going to infringe on that. Jerry was very careful to build his house 8 feet off the property line. However, he built his driveway 1 foot over onto Huldah's property line. So what did Huldah do? And it apparently was a paved driveway. She made Jerry tear up the driveway and move it 1 foot onto his property. And George Van Marter tells me that, as I said, Huldah had installed these metal stakes on her property line, but at night, one of the boys would sneak out and move the stakes to where he thought the property line would be. Huldah would go out the next morning, move the stakes back where she thought the property line would be. And George, now this, I'm talking about the era of the 1940s. The Van Marters bought the house in the 1960s, and George was outside one day, shortly after they'd moved in. He had just cut down a maple tree. He said, suddenly a car pulls into the driveway, and Huldah storms out of the car And she walks back to George in the backyard and says, I came to make sure you know where the property lines are. So this was 20, 30 years later. She's still worried about the property lines. But anyway, that's Huldah for you in a nutshell. She was employed by the town to dig the graves up in the South Salem Cemetery over by Echo Farm. And think of it, she didn't have a backhoe. She didn't have a little steam shovel. She had a shovel. And as George said, if you've ever tried to dig in South Salem soil, it's hardpan. And she was digging these graves 6 feet deep with a shovel. Now, there were a couple of other grave diggers. Huldah wasn't the only one, but for a woman, that was an awesome job. She also, according to George, who was really fond of her, she said she had quite a vocabulary, and that vocabulary usually consisted mostly of 4-letter words, and she wasn't afraid to use them. I'm now kind of given you, I think I've given you a good picture of Huldah, but what I want to do is just read one of John Poe's poems, as supposedly he was sitting out next in the little field next to where Huldah was pounding away with her stakes and her lumber, and John would be sitting there writing his poems. The reason I can read you a poem is a lot of them were published in the Ridgefield Press back in the 1930s. And this one is from 1933 by John A. Poe, and it's called Broilers or Fowl. If you see a gay young chicken come strutting down the road, and the roosters on the corner say, hey fellas, get a load, make up your mind, not too quickly, if you're looking for a wife, if that gay young chicken strutting there would be nothing but storm and strife. Now I've been married many years, a happy life I've had, for I didn't pick a giddy chick, but a staid old hen instead. So I don't know if that described Huldah to him, but that was one of his better little ditties. She and John Poe were married for about 30 years, but then in 1948, Huldah divorced John and married a gentleman named Joseph Rush. Now, we found a picture of the two couples. It was, I think, at the time of John's wedding to another woman, and it is a picture of John, Huldah, the other lady who I don't know her name, John's new wife, and Huldah's new husband, Joseph. Obviously still friends enough to link arms and have their picture taken. Huldah died in 1971 at a lively old age. Most of the Lewisboro ladies seem to live a fairly long life, except for poor Edith Bailey, who died from diabetes, who I talked about last time. All right, now I'm going to talk about Margaret Frances Peggy, most people knew her by, Bacon. She was born in 1895. She was a writer, an artist, an illustrator, and the daughter of artists. It's a little confusing. All the internet information on Peggy Bacon says she was born in Ridgefield. However, at the time of her birth, her parents lived on Spring Street in South Salem. And South Salem, or all of Lewisboro, has this interesting postal history where South Salem people had Ridgefield addresses for quite a while, and the people down in Vista had New Canaan addresses up until the 1970s. So the fact that historians who've never visited our town can say that Peggy Bacon was born in Ridgefield, I think we have to take that with a grain of salt and assume that I know her parents were living in South Salem at that time. So I think we can claim Peggy Bacon as a daughter of Lewisboro. Now, Peggy probably at this point is not a name that's well known, but she was considered quite quite famous in the 1920s and the 1930s. She was well known, as I say, as a writer. She was an artist. She was an illustrator. And just for a few of the magazines that she illustrated, I have to read the list because it's quite long. She had her work published in Vanity Fair, Harper's Bazaar, Mademoiselle, Dial, Vogue, The New Yorker, and the Yale Review, aside from illustrating some 40 books and writing more books of her own. In fact, she wrote over she was involved with the publication of over 60 books. Her parents were both artists, and she had a rather bohemian childhood. Her parents didn't believe in school, so she had tutors, and she was allowed to study anything that she wanted, which was mostly Latin, Greek, history, anthropology, nothing as practical as arithmetic. Finally, she said they didn't have they ate well, but they were kind of poverty-stricken. She was finally given the opportunity to go to the Kent Place School in New Jersey, a private school, where she graduated from in 1913. That schooling was given to her by some friends. She graduated in 1913, and in 1913 her father, who was a recovering alcoholic, committed suicide. So it was quite a banner year for her. In 1915, she had graduated. She had started school in New York City, but she got the measles, and so she was under quarantine back home in South Salem. And while there, she wrote and illustrated her first book, which was called True Philosophers and Other Cat Tales. She loved cats. It shows in a lot of her work. She attended the New York School of Fine and Applied Arts. She didn't really like that. It wasn't to her liking. So she segued over to the Art Students League, where she took courses, and she also taught there for several years. In 1919, she went up to Woodstock, to another artist's colony. She met another art student named Alex Brooke, and in 1920 they were married. They spent a brief time in England where her daughter was born, but they came right back to the United States and settled up in Woodstock for a while, and then back in the early 1920s, moved back to New York City. And their main house was in New York City, but they summered in Cross River from 1927 to 1937. She and Alex got on along for a while, and then in 1940 they divorced. I'm going to just go over some of the accolades that she received. In 1953, she won the Edgar Allan Poe Mystery Award for a mystery called The Inward Eye. In 1975, there was a retrospective at the Smithsonian Natural Collection of Fine and Applied Arts, and she was the first living woman to have a retrospective at the Smithsonian, at that particular collection of fine arts. In 1980, she won the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters Gold Medal for lifelong contributions to illustrations and graphic arts. So even though you may find her books in the library today, and I'm sure you can get them from interlibrary loan if our own library doesn't have them, she had quite a recognizable lifetime of arts. She died in 1987 in Cape Porpoise, Maine, where she had gone to live in her later years, because apparently she did start to go blind, and her son lived up in Cape Porpoise. And so that is where she died at the age of 92. I want to mention a little bit of a segue here between Peggy Bacon and Alice Neergaard, who I talked about earlier. I did say Alice Neergaard was very interested in starting the South Salem Drama Club. Well, the drama club had their home in the Bacon Barn. The Bacon Barn was on the corner of Spring Street and Boutonville Road. But in the the 1940s, it was moved out to Route 35, where it became a little better known as the Hayloft Restaurant. And so the Bacon Barn fits into the life of Peggy Bacon as well as into the life of Alice Neergaard. Our next lady is probably the most famous of any of the women we've talked about. Her name is Colleen Dewhurst, and she lived on Boutonville Road at the Flood Farm for, well, onwards more than 25 years. She lived there with her on and off husband, George C. Scott. Actually, they were married twice during their tenure at the farm. And she was well loved in the community, and she also loved the community. She was a huge community supporter, always ready and willing to appear at any function that the town might have, including several at the library. She was an actor, a community supporter, and probably best known among her friends as the hostess of The Farm. The farm being Flood Farm on Boutonville Road. I'm going to read a little bit later on from her autobiography, which was written half by her, and she unfortunately died during the writing, and so her friends finished it up for her. It's a wonderful book, so I really urge you all to go look for Colleen Dewhurst, an autobiography. She was born in Montreal in 1924, and she was an only child. She had a fairly peripatetic life. Her family moved quite often. A few times through Canada, then her father's job brought them down to Boston, and so they lived in Massachusetts for part of her growing up, and then they moved. Her father was transferred or had a job in New York City, so they moved down to the Bronx and Manhattan and ended up in Crestwood and the Yonkers area. So she moved a lot in her life. A lot of what I'm going to say did come out of her book, and the editor of her book said that she was a voice that could fill the theater and reach into the soul. And I think if you've ever seen her act in person, you can understand that what is meant by a voice that could fill a theater and reach into the soul. She was a sickly child in her early formative years, and she apparently had an illness at some point that affected her throat. And her mother was always looking for ways to cure this illness. And one of them was particularly brutal. She had tried several different doctors and found this doctor in Montreal, it was in Canada, who operated on his kitchen table on Colleen's throat, if you can imagine that sort of thing happening. We're probably talking about 1929 or so. But Colleen and her mother showed up at this doctor's house. He said, "I always read from the Bible before I operate." So the doctor read whatever he read from the Bible, and he said, "Oh, and I don't have a nurse available today, so Mrs. Dewhurst, you're going to have to help me." So they laid 4 or 5-year-old Colleen on the kitchen table. Her mother had the ether cone to put over her face to anesthetize her, and this good doctor butchered her throat, or did something which didn't apparently heal properly. So Colleen, for the next few years, she said, "I was never without a white kerchief around my throat." She also had medication after medication to take. And she said, Colleen mentioned that when she was about 8, her mother said, "Come with me," brought her into the bathroom, sat her on the tub, and went to the medicine chest and took out all the bottles of pills and threw them in the trash can. And she said after that, we took off the white kerchief. We never had any more pills. But that might be one reason why she had such a throaty, evocative kind of a voice. She doesn't say, I don't think she even knows, but she did say her mother was a heavy smoker, and Colleen herself was a heavy smoker. Colleen was a tomboy, and maybe partly because at one point, coming home from school, well, let's just go back a wee bit. Her mother had always taught her when she met somebody to curtsy. And so when she started first grade at a new school, was taken to the classroom, introduced to the teacher, and she curtsied. Well, the teacher might have been impressed, but her classmates weren't, and they kind of looked at her as a little odd. And so not too long after that, when she was walking home from school, a bunch of 6-year-old girls decided they had to do something about it. So they accosted her and started to beat her up. So she went home, told her mother, and her father overheard this and said, "This is not good. I'm going to teach you how to protect yourself." Not to start a fight, but definitely to protect yourself. So he taught her how to box. And she did quite well at the lessons. The next time, and actually did that right that night after the incident happened. The next day, not only were the girls waiting, but there were some boys waiting, and they tied her up with a rope and were swinging her around. She finally was able to land a soccer punch on one of the girls. Blood started streaming down the girl's nose. Everybody ran home. By the time Colleen got in the house to explain to her mom what had happened, the mother of the girl who had been soccer punched was on the phone saying her daughter probably had a broken nose. And Colleen's mother said, "Well, I guess my daughter did a good job." And she wasn't bothered again by that, but she did love not only boxing, she loved baseball. She would play on, as she got to be a little older, a teenager, she would play on the boys' baseball teams, and she was a good player. That stood her in good stead because during her time here in South Salem, she was the co-manager of a baseball team with, I believe, Mary Herzog was one of her helper coaches. And the name of that team was the Fireflies. It was a girls' team called the Fireflies. She moved, well, I won't go into all of her theater history. I think that is easy enough for you to find. I mainly want to concentrate on her life here in town. They moved to the farm in the 1960s because they didn't want their sons, Alex and Campbell, to go to the New York City schools. They wanted them to have a public school education. And so they were, Alex first, because Alex was the older one, was enrolled at Lewisboro School. And that leads to a story that I'm going to read about in a little bit. When they first moved to the farm, Colleen said she couldn't stand it. She just drove into the city every day. The farm was a place to sleep, but where her life was New York City. It was the only constant in my life. The farm became totally unruly, and that's her quote, completely unruly. There were drop-overs, drop-ins, drop-outs. There were authors, there were writers, there were artists, there were people out of work who needed a place to sleep. All these people showed up at the farm, and the big country kitchen table became the gathering place for many, many people. A lot of Broadway people, a lot of actors and actresses. The farm, it was a farm in that Colleen loved to collect birds, dogs, cats, parrots. They had mules, occasionally they had goats. So when she wasn't busy holding forth at the farm, she would volunteer for the town. And I think one day I even saw her selling cookies for some organization in front of D'Agostino's or whatever supermarket we had there at the time. She was always ready to come to the library. when the library was expanded in 1974, she was there for the celebration of the library, and she also did a reading at the library of classics, and she was a big hit. That night, I remember being there. She started to read, and of course the power went out. People can identify with that nowadays, but luckily the power came on after not too much longer, and we could continue with our Colleen Dewhurst presentation. She was Actors Equity President from 1985 to 1991 when she passed away. She passed away from pancreatic cancer in 1991. She was a Christian Scientist, which may have had something to do with the fact that she died as quickly as she did once she became ill. I want to read something from her book. It has to do with Alex, who hated to have his mother show up at school for anything because he felt his mother was so different from other mothers. She wasn't a homemaker. She was this crazy actress lady. And so Colleen tried to stay out of his school life as much as she could. But in the middle of December of that first grade year, his teacher called, and I'm reading now, his teacher called to ask me a favor. Every year, she said, one of the parents would come in and play Santa Claus for the day. I couldn't believe what I knew she was about to ask. Poor Alex was already nervous about his mother doing anything strange or different from the other mothers. I had already flunked the required baking of homemade cookies that each child occasionally brought from home, and now I was being asked to show up in drag. This teacher swore she hadn't been able to get anyone else to do it. I didn't agree until the next day when a peculiar little Santa suit arrived, lined with white tassels that looked like they had last been seen on kitchen curtains. No wonder she couldn't find anyone. Word was obviously out to everyone but me about the costume. I kept my upcoming participation a secret from Alex and explained to his teacher in advance that if he seemed upset by my appearance, I would leave at once. As the afternoon of my debut approached, I was in agony. I literally threw up before I left the house, worrying if I was going to ruin my oldest child's experience in first grade and perhaps scar him for life. An opening night on Broadway was nothing compared to this. And here's a little quote from the end of her book, and she says, "Give is the word. You have something to give. You're not out there to take. You have at least two things to give, your talent and your compassion, with no judgment." I hope you've enjoyed the lives of the women that I've shared with you. I'm Maureen Koehl, Lewisboro Town Historian, hoping to talk to you again soon.
You're watching Lewisboro Community Television, Channel 20.